Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to HBH Podcast. Are you ready? Ready?
Now, before I say anything, I know it's been a minute since I've done an episode. I needed a new microphone. I don't know if you guys heard on the last episode when I talked about Scream 7. My mic was cutting in and out. I don't know if it even was a mic problem. I'm starting to think it was possibly a problem with my laptop. So with that being said, I might have two mics now, but I wanted to buy a new mic anyways because the one that I was using, I've already had for a couple of years. But something was going on, so I got a new microphone. Hopefully this sounds a lot better. So yeah, it's good to finally be back. I know it's been a couple weeks since I did the last episode. If you guys haven't watched the last episode, check it out. Again, it was about Scream 7. And let me just say, I am done talking about Scream in general. I'm just over it. I'm just sick of the whole Scream thing. Today, though, I wanted to talk about the Texas Chainsaw Massacre and 70s horror. But before I get into that, I will say that history was made for HBH Podcast yesterday. There is now a exclusive Spotify episode where I talk about gateway horror. If you're a younger fan or if you're a parent and you're not 100% sure on what you should show your kid to start them out with, I gave some recommendations on that episode. Again, that is a Spotify exclusive episode. If you guys want to play that, it's on the Spotify account, which is just HBH Podcast. I will also have it linked in the description down below. Funny enough, I didn't know what to talk about for this episode, which I think that's kind of funny because, I haven't done one in a couple of weeks, so you would think that I would have an idea of something to talk about when I really don't. My idea was to talk about gateway horror films and gateway horror shows, but I figured something like that may not do great here on YouTube, so I thought I'd throw it on Spotify as a Spotify exclusive. But yeah, today's episode is going to be fun. I just felt like talking about the Texas Chainsaw Massacre a little bit. This isn't going to be a review on the film or anything like that. This is a retrospect. I just want to talk about the film, talk about 70s horror a little bit, because the Texas Chainsaw Massacre is a film that I love dearly, but I don't talk about a lot here on the channel, so I was like, it needs to have its own podcast. But before I get into even talking about the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, I want to talk a little bit about Tobe Hooper. I feel like Tobe Hooper is, obviously a very popular horror director, very well known in the horror community, but Tobe Hooper isn't, to me, on that status of John Carpenter, Wes Craven, George Romero. I always feel like he's like a layer below them, which I don't think it should be that way, because for me, I would put Tobe Hooper up there with the guys that I just mentioned. Tobe Hooper has some great films. Some films that really impacted the genre a lot, like the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, Poltergeist. I think the Funhouse even. That's one that's not talked about enough. The Funhouse is definitely one that I feel like impacted the genre. He made films like Eaten Alive, Invaders from Mars, Life Force, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre 2. I mean, Tobe Hooper is a very talented director, one of the best horror directors ever. I think he even did an episode or two of Masters of Horror, but Tobe Hooper, to me, I feel like he just isn't talked about as much as some of those other directors that I just mentioned, which is kind of sad. Tobe Hooper did pass away in 2017. He was 74 years old, and his cause of death was natural causes, apparently. You know what's weird? I don't remember hearing about when Tobe Hooper passed away. I mean, I'm sure it was all over the place, but for some reason I don't fully remember that, and I don't know why. But yeah, Tobe Hooper is a director to look out for, and he's also a director that is more than just the Texas Chainsaw Massacre and Poltergeist. Like I said, the Funhouse, I would highly recommend. Life Force, I would highly recommend as well. Eaten Alive, for sure. The Mangler. I think out of all of the films that I've named off, I would recommend the Funhouse the most. I think that is the most underrated Tobe Hooper film. But enough talking about Tobe Hooper. let's talk a little bit about, before I even get into the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, I know that's what you're all here for, and you're probably like, why is this guy talking about 100 different things? I want to talk about 70s horror real quick, and just the feel of 70s horror. Now, obviously, I think like the 80s is definitely one of the golden decades of horror, but I think the 70s is just as good as the 80s. Now, if you're a slasher fan like I am, you know, the 80s slasher craze was great. But the 70s has this unmatched feel than any other decade in horror. There's like this gritty, just nasty, raw feel to horror films in the 70s. And that leads me into the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. I think the Texas Chainsaw Massacre is the definitive, gritty, raw, nasty 70s horror film. It is the essential staple of the 70s. It is the main 70s horror film that I think is think about the most when you think of the 70s. I mean, you could say The Exorcist, but I really think it's the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Last year, I watched a documentary that came out called Chain Reactions. If you're a Texas Chainsaw Massacre fan, you probably know of that documentary. You may not, though, because it is newer. And, you know, there's interviews from directors, and I think even Stephen King's involved with it, and people just, you know, they're telling their story on how they were introduced to the film and the impact that it had, and how, you know, I think one of them even said that, you know, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre just felt so real. And that's kind of what I wanted to get into. Like, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, to me, to this day, in 2026, is still a scary horror film, and I say that because of how realistic the Texas Chainsaw Massacre really is. You know, put yourself in the character's shoes. Like, you know, if you're out in Texas or wherever it may be in a rural area, you got to think something like this can happen. If there's not houses around for miles and you're really out in the middle of nowhere, you don't know what you can run into. And I think that's what makes the Texas Chainsaw Massacre so scary, is because of how real it feels. You know, they run into this family of cannibals, you know, Sally and Franklin, you know, Jerry, all of them. They go out there and they run into this family of cannibals. Like, you don't know what you can run into out in the middle of nowhere, especially, you know, an area that you're not familiar with. And I just thought about that recently, and it's funny because I think today's, you know, the younger audience, the younger horror fans of today may not like the Texas Chainsaw Massacre as much because, you know, now if they made the, let's say the Texas Chainsaw Massacre was made today, the original film, not a remake, not a sequel, nothing like that, you know, with a title called the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, you would think that it's going to be a massacre. There's going to be some crazy stuff in this film. You know, going back and watching the original Chainsaw Massacre from 74, there's not a ton of kills in it. You know, with the word massacre being in the title, you would think that it would be a pretty insane movie. And I still think it is an insane movie, but it's not a high body count like you would think it's going to be. So I think for some of the younger horror fans, they may not like it as much just because of the title alone could be a little misleading to them because of how things are today. You know, film today is way different than what it was in the 70s. But yeah, man, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, I'll never forget the first time I watched it. I remember just having a weird feeling during the entire film because of how it feels. It really does feel real. It has a raw feel that is, it's grainy, it just has a raw feel. I think that's the best way to put it. It almost feels like you are really watching something that you shouldn't be watching. And I think that was something else that was said on the Chain Reactions documentary. It just feels like this is something you shouldn't be watching. And I love that. And then I think about movies today. It's like, we're not going to get anything like this ever again. And that's why the Texas Chainsaw Massacre holds up so well over 50 years after its release, because of that feel that it has. I don't know why I felt the need to come on here and just blab about the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. I guess it's a crime that, you know, here on the channel, I don't have a ton of content over the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. I think I did a ranking podcast, maybe an MMR Live episode over the newer film, but that's really about it, and I've never really talked about the original film. And I just think that impact that Chainsaw had is incredible. As a horror fan, even looking back on it, even though I wasn't alive when it came out, I don't really know fully the reactions when it came out, but just looking back on it, it's like that impact that it had is insane. You know, it's one of the earliest slasher films. Slasher films as we know them today, and how we would get to know them in the 80s as well. You know, all of that kind of started somewhat around the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. But yeah, I wanted to get on here and just kind of appreciate it and kind of give a retrospect on the film and talk about Tobe Hooper a little bit. You know, I'd love to hear your guys' story in the comment section down below of how you got introduced to the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, or if you remember the first time you've seen the film, and kind of talk a little bit about that. Okay, so what I want to do now is just read off 10 facts about the Texas Chainsaw Massacre and see if there are some things that I didn't know that you may not know. You know, I thought that'd be kind of a fun idea. So, the first thing here, I think everyone knew this. The character of Leatherface was inspired... Let me retry this here. The character of Leatherface was inspired by a real-life serial killer, Ed Gein, who also served as the inspiration for Norman Bates in Psycho and Buffalo Bill in The Silence of the Lambs. I think everyone knew that. That's one that's been talked about a lot. You know, a lot of people like to try to say that the Texas Chainsaw Massacre is based on a true story, which it's not. You know, it's not, but it's loosely based off of Ed Gein. Alright, let's see. The film's opening narration and marketing suggest the events were entirely true to attract a wider audience. In reality, while inspired by Gein's macabre handiwork, the plot was completely fictional, which I just talked about. Obviously, which was smart though on their part. I mean, to make it feel real like that, it really does. Even to this day, when you watch the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, it's almost like you're watching a documentary. The film was shot in Texas summer heat, often exceeding 110 degrees Fahrenheit because the production had a limited wardrobe. The actors wore the same unwashed clothes for weeks. By the end, the smell on the set was reportedly so foul that the crew would avoid being near the actors. That's crazy. I think I've actually heard that before, but I'm not sure. Gunnar Hansen, who played Leatherface, had limited visibility behind his mask. During the famous ending dance, he was actually swinging a live running chainsaw without a chain break, making the scene genuinely dangerous for everyone nearby. That, I actually don't know if I knew that or not. That is very interesting. Very dangerous. They would not let something like that happen today. There's no way that would slide on any production today. The dinner scene was filmed during a single 26-hour marathon session between the rotting food on the table, the intense heat from the lights, and the exhaustion of the cast. The hysterics and discomfort seen on screen were largely genuine. That's crazy. I actually think I heard that one before too, but I can't remember. I've seen a few Texas Chainsaw Massacre documentaries, chain reactions. I think there's a couple in... There's a DVD set, 40th anniversary set, I think that Dark Sky put out that has a couple documentaries in it as well. But I've heard some of that stuff before. Despite being banned in several countries for its extreme violence, there is very little actual blood shown on screen. Director Tobe Hooper hoped for a PG rating and relied on sound design and the theater of the mind to make the audience think they were seeing more than they were, which I definitely can see that. There is not a ton of blood in the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and it doesn't need it. It's amazing how, like, before the 80s, how a lot of, you know, slasher films that are so beloved now, and a lot of people's favorite films like the Texas Chainsaw Massacre and Halloween have little blood in it. I always thought that was kind of cool. Tobe Hooper claimed he came up with the idea while standing in a crowded hardware store department. Frustrated by the crowd, he saw a display of chainsaws and joked to himself that he could get to the front of the line much faster if he started one up. So that's kind of how he came up with the idea of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. It's actually pretty funny, and a cool little story, which I think I actually heard Tobe say that before, possibly, but I've definitely heard that. Leatherface wears 3 different masks in the film: the killing mask, the old lady mask, and the pretty woman mask. Gunnar Hansen treated these as different personalities for the character, changing his behavior based on which one he wore, which you can see that if you go back and watch the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, when he does change wardrobe and he's wearing a different mask, you can tell that he really went out to change the character and give it a different personality. You can definitely see that, and that's great acting. Gunnar Henson was perfect as Leatherface, and I have no complaints. And I think that's a cool way of doing that, because, you know, this family and Leatherface is just so unhinged as it is that a character like that would do that. Like, they would definitely change personalities like that, so it's pretty cool. Marilyn Burns, who played Sally, was subjected to actual physical roughhousing during filming to ensure her terror looked real. She was poked with a real needle during the dinner scene because the stage blood prop wouldn't work. I've heard that before as well, and that is also crazy. That would not be allowed on any production today. It's, you know, you read this stuff and you go back and think about older horror films, slasher, not slasher, it doesn't matter, on, like, how they did some of this stuff, like, would just not be allowed today. Like on The Exorcist, William Friedkin pushed down Ellie Burstyn's character, and she, like, actually injured her back. So, I mean, it's just crazy how that stuff happened back then and they got away with it, which I'm not saying it's right, because you couldn't do it today, and even if you could do it today, it wouldn't be right. But it's just crazy how they just made things work back then. You know, making a film back then is definitely different than what it is today. The film was made on a shoestring budget of roughly $140,000. It went on to gross over $30 million at the domestic box office, making it one of the most profitable independent films of all time, which makes sense. I mean, the way that they marketed the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, you know, the way that word gets out, you know, especially back then, there's no internet, so it's all word of mouth, and it's just amazing that it made that much money. Like, people were that intrigued by the film that you know, they went to go see it. People thought it was real. There was people probably saying, hey, you got to check out the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, it's crazy, and it's just amazing. It really is. I love the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and I just wanted to get on here and kind of blab about it and just talk about 70s horror and how gritty it feels and how raw it feels, and how the Texas Chainsaw Massacre to me is like the movie of the 70s. When I think of 70s horror, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre is number one, no doubt. But if you guys did enjoy this podcast, again, let me know your story of when you first watched the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Let me know if it's your favorite horror movie of all time. And with that being said, leave a like and subscribe. That would be much appreciated. And don't play with chainsaws.